You can be seated. L'Shana Tova, everyone. I feel so uplifted to be able to be here with all of you to celebrate Rosh Hashanah. And I don't take it for granted. It's an amazing blessing that we've cleared out time. We've sort of made a choice to move away from our busy schedules and work and realize that we need to be here to support and strengthen each other. And it really is a marvelous blessing in what's been a dark and challenging year, and where I feel as though we've realized the need for Jewish community and community just all the more. So let's say Shehechianu once more to appreciate the blessing of being here together in this moment. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam Shehechianu v'kiyamanu v'higianu lazman hazeh. You know, Jews are famous for many things, and among them, I think fairly, is anxiety. You may know the old joke, Moshe sends a text to Shlomo, start worrying, details to follow. I'm no exception to this. I've had my moments of fear, anxiety, even panic. And I want to share a story with you that I've told very few people because it embarrasses me, about a trip I took to Israel many years ago before I came to Kol Hamet. I'd made plans to go to a learning workshop, and I was traveling by myself, landed in Tel Aviv, got into a sherut, if you remember the shared taxis before high-speed rail, and made my way up to Jerusalem. I was staying in an apartment that a friend of mine lived in, who was coincidentally in Canada, so he told me I could use his place while I was there. So I found the key, let myself in, had a little food, took a shower, and fell fast asleep. And I woke up several hours later, and it was pitch black outside. And I was jet-lagged, and I was uptight, and had all this kind of nervous energy. And as I was sitting there tossing and turning and trying to go back to sleep, I had all these thoughts arise. I'm alone here. There's no one else in this place. Actually, there's no one within thousands of miles who knows or loves me. If something were to happen to me during this conference, no one would even know for days and days, and on, getting more and more worked up and afraid. I got up and I paced for a while. I tried to lay back down, but it was no use. I was really having a full-blown panic attack. And as the sun began to come up that morning, I picked up the phone. If you can remember wired telephones. I picked up the phone. I think I'd flown in on Delta, so I called Delta Airlines. I arranged for a flight out. I was in Israel for barely 12 hours. And then I had to send a kind of embarrassing email to my aunt and uncle who live in Jerusalem that I had been planning to see that night. And my aunt sent me back the sweetest response. My aunt's ultra-Orthodox. She said, you know, Hashem, God, must have wanted you to leave. Maybe something dangerous was going to happen to you here. There's a reason you have to be back in the States. I'm sure you did the right thing. And while I found the letter comforting and sweet, I knew it wasn't true. The reality is I'd given into my fears. I cheated myself of what would have been, no doubt, a wonderful experience, and also laid out for a fairly exorbitant ticket home. That's my worst experience with fear. But I have had other moments that have been uncomfortable for me. I remember towards the beginning of the pandemic, if you recall, our first big Zoom event was a virtual Seder. So as you can imagine, I was a little tense and uptight getting ready. I was still new to Zoom hosting. I feel like I'm reasonably accomplished now. And as I was setting up, my girls were in the kitchen cooking for the Seder for us to eat at home. And I'm worried how this is going to go and what it's going to be like. And they're playing music and dancing, and it's a little bit loud. So I start this iteration in my head. This Seder is really important. Aren't they going to turn the music down? Don't they realize that people need this connection badly, and we haven't seen yet if Zoom is going to work for us? And if it doesn't work, maybe people will think it's not going to be good during the pandemic, and the synagogue will completely fall apart. So as I'm getting more and more worked up, I jump out of my chair, I go into the kitchen, and I yell at them. And I say, why are you being so selfish? Don't you understand what I'm doing? It was totally undeserved because, of course, they were engaged in an act of service for me. They were trying to make dinner for us for that evening. I actually had a period of time during the pandemic, or about 18 months, where I took Lexapro, an anti-anxiety medication, to help get a little more stability and be able to develop some tools and skills to manage my fears. Fear is natural and normal and even necessary. But when we iterate on our fears, when we catastrophize, our fears come to control us, and it pushes away joy, and it makes us short-tempered and difficult with the people around us, and we lose out on experiences that we might otherwise be able to appreciate. And I worry that our whole culture wants to create an environment of anxiety and fear. In a short period of time, I got 2 mailings from, let's just say, ideologically distinct pro-Israel organizations. One letter said, "There are missiles falling in the south of Israel. We need your support now, or there might not be an Israel tomorrow." And a few days later, I got another letter saying Israel's democracy is in danger. If you don't support us now, it might not be here tomorrow. 2 organizations that frankly agree on almost nothing agreed that if I were anxious, I was more likely to give them money. There is a whole infrastructure that tries to keep us anxious, worried, and concerned because when we're like that, we're quicker to give money, we stay more engaged online, we get more politically involved. In other words, it serves those purposes. So when I'm in such a moment and I realize that I've got a personal issue and also a communal issue, the first place I look is my Jewish toolbox. And I realize that we have a beautiful teaching on fear that's been turned into a song that many of us know. It starts like this. Kol ha'olam kulo, gesher tsar meod, gesher tsar meod. It's a song, we'll sing the whole thing later, I promise. It's a song based on a Rabbi Nachman teaching that was written by a rabbi named Baruch Haidt. He's actually still alive. He's a contemporary on the Israeli music scene. I believe he wrote the melody in the 60s. And he changed the words just a little bit. He wrote, "The whole world is a narrow bridge, and the main thing is not to be afraid at all." But Rabbi Nachman's teaching is a little bit longer. It says, "Vida, sh'adam sarich lavord al gesher tsar meod meod, v'klal v'ikar shelo yitpached klal." He wrote, "And know that a person needs to get across an extremely narrow bridge, a very, very narrow bridge. And the main thing is not to make yourself afraid at all." So Rabbi Haidt made a couple of changes that are helpful. He got rid of the extra me'od. He condensed the language a little bit so it was a better song. But he made one substantive change that's problematic. Instead of saying shelo yitpached, we shouldn't make ourselves afraid, he changed it to we shouldn't be afraid at all. Rabbi Nachman would never teach something like this because we need fear. I think about a trip I took a few years ago to Yellowstone, and I was sitting by this beautiful waterfall, and there was a railing, separating us from the cliff drop to lead to the waterfall. Some young adult jumped over the railing, was kind of balancing on the edge of the waterfall, I think to impress his girlfriend. A little fear could have been a good thing. Or the way I see people on bicycles around here without helmets, or worse, parents who've clearly strapped their children into their helmet and even other safety gear, and they're not themselves wearing a bike helmet, as if adults are somehow immune from brain injury. A little fear might be called for. But the danger is when we iterate on our fears, when we allow them to get out of control, when they begin to control us, and they cheat us from joy, good experiences, and turn us short-tempered with people that we love and care about. I have a teacher that I've stayed in touch with from college who had a bridge of her own that she needed to cross. She was diagnosed with a very frightening cancer and with a very difficult treatment plan. And my teacher, she lives on her own. She doesn't have much family. And so she knew she was going to have to get through this, get across this bridge without much support. And initially, as she began her treatment, she had sleepless nights because she'd come home after an exhausting day, and then she'd kind of sit and begin to worry about what tomorrow would be like. It was so draining and exhausting today, how will I even handle the next day? And after a few days, she realized she needed to change her habit, so she decided on the following practice. Each day when she got home, she let herself feel whatever it was she was feeling, which sometimes meant just exhaustion and staring at the ceiling for a while. Other times she would sort of cry from the pain and difficulty of it. And then as the fearful thoughts would begin to arise, she started to sing to herself. Kol ha'olam kulo, gesher tsar meod. And that mantra helped soothe and calm her so she could fall asleep and have some renewed resilience for the next day. I'm grateful that my teacher was able to cross that bridge. She's been healthy actually for 5 years. And I feel like she let herself use tools of resilience to be able to let go of her fears and find the strength she needed to get across that bridge. Rabbi Nachman continues in an actually much longer essay on fear. And know, each time you detach and shift just a bit from materialism to God's service, all the movements and changes accumulate, combine, and bind together, and come to your aid at a time of need when there is, God forbid, any trouble or misfortune. Rabbi Nachman is warning us from excessive connection to material objects to routine. Many of you know Jack Adler. Jack and Betty have been longtime members of Kol Hamet, and Jack lives over at Moldau now, the independent living connected to the OFJCC. And Jack has mentioned to me many times that he wished he had moved to Moldau earlier because it's been so wonderful for him. It was his attachment to his home, his fear of a new place, the way he was connected to routine that kept him from going to what has ended up being a wonderful new community, friendship, and kind of intellectually stimulating environment that's been wonderful for him and for Betty. And now that Jack is actually in hospice care, it's been an incredible gift for Betty. Because Betty, who is so loving and devoted to Jack, who spends hours and hours with him, feeding him, doing puzzles with him, holding his hand, she can now also be present for him in this amazing way, and then also go for a walk with a friend a few laps around the JCC. She can go for dinner for a few minutes with some people she cares about and get renewed and then go back up. People can stop by and say a quick hello. It's given them a community and a strength at a time that could have been otherwise isolating and lonely and difficult, because they were able to cross over that bridge, to look past their fears and make this change. You know, in Rabbi Nachman's time, narrow bridges were more common than they are now. It used to be that you'd often cross over a river with just a couple of planks of wood and no railing, with the river rushing underneath. I had my own kind of experience with something like a narrow bridge actually this summer. Carol and I were in Hawaii and we'd found this swimming hole we wanted to go to. And to get down, you had to kind of crawl down this path. We weren't even sure we were in the right place at first. And then there's a kind of cliff face where you can either scramble down and drop the last bit, or there was a log someone had leaned up against the cliff face to scramble the last bit. So on the way down, I just sort of climbed down the rock and dropped the last few feet. But I'm sort of eyeing this log, realizing I'm going to have to climb this to get out of here again. So we're swimming, we're having a good time, but part of me is looking at the log. And I get more and more worked up, and finally I say to Carol, I think it's time for me to go. And we swim back over, and this is atypical for me. I kind of quickly throw my shoes on. I say, listen, I just got to climb up. You get ready when you're ready. So I walk over, and I've seen lots of people, frankly, in not as good shape as me, climbing up this log just fine. And I start climbing up, and I make the mistake of looking down. And my legs start to shake, and the whole log starts to move. And I realize I'm going to knock this thing over, and I'm not going to be able to get up. So I take a breath, and I realize this is actually the narrow bridge. And I just need to get across this and get up to the top. And so I kind of half closed my eyes. I quickly scrambled up the last bit and made it safely back to the car. When we're frightened, we lose our balance both literally and figuratively. The bridges that otherwise we could cross with ease become incredible barriers to us. Irving Yalom, the great therapist, in his book Love Executioner, tells the story of a man who had a bridge of his own that he desperately needed to cross. He had a patient named Carlos who had had a recurrent lymphoma for all of his adult life. And the lymphoma had come back in a very virulent and probably deadly form. But the problem with Carlos is that he was a deeply unpleasant human being. He was mean and judgmental in group. He was awful and nasty to Dr. Yalom and to the other therapists, and he was particularly misogynist and demeaning towards women, to the point that his own young daughter he'd actually driven away with kind of nasty and sexist comments. So Dr. Yalom confronted him at one point and said, "How would you like your daughter to grow up in a world where men treat her the way you treat other women?" And this got through somehow to Carlos, and he said, "I wouldn't like that at all." And he began to make some changes in himself to start realizing that he could treat women as actually human beings, that he could start realizing and listen to the wants and needs and concerns that other people were bringing into the group. He was able to reconcile with his daughter and his older son to the point that they came to live with him the last few months of his life. He realized that he was afraid not just of his mortality, but on a deep level, he was afraid of whether he was worthy of being loved. And so he pushed people away rather than confront that fear. And Dr. Yalom helped him realize that it was worth getting across the bridge and extending trust in the hopes that he could restore some meaningful relationships. At the end of Carlos's life, when he was on his deathbed, he actually asked for Dr. Yalom to come visit him. And as he walked into the room, Carlos extended his hand and they held hands. And Carlos said, "I want to thank you for saving my life." Dr. Yalom had helped him realize that he was worthy of being loved, that each day he could live with meaning, and though he didn't extend his life, he made each day filled with meaning. He was able to reunite with his children and even be silly with them. He could roll around on the floor. He made fun of his disease, by the way. He referred to it as lymphoma, and restore human connection. His life, he suddenly realized, was worth saving. Rabbi Nachman concludes his teaching by telling us about how important joy and silliness is. Vaikar, he says, the essence, liyot besimcha tamid. The main thing is to be always happy. Rabbi Nachman realizes that fear is a joy killer. And what we need to do when we're not feeling joy is sometimes to act it, to fake it till we make it, if you will, to be silly and goofy. That's where our custom of jumping up and down when we bring out the Torah comes from, because it's a little ridiculous. And we can kind of laugh at ourselves and realize that all these concerns and worries that we're carrying around aren't as big and important as we think they are. And in that moment of breath, suddenly we create room for joy. This is why I also like when the bar and bat mitzvah students, they always sit over here. I like to come over and kind of jump up and down in this place to get them to laugh. Because if they can have that moment of jumping up and down and realizing this is actually going to be fun, they just sort of take a breath and then they can appreciate the experience in a much more whole way. I still have issues with worry and anxiety and concern. I suspect I always will. My parents do, my grandparents did, their grandparents did. But now I feel like I have some tools that I want to share with you of how to keep my fears from controlling me and staying in touch with joy and meaning. Mental health professionals and medicines are a part of it, but there are also skills and tools that we can develop. First, I had developed the bad habit of looking at my cell phone first thing in the morning. Somehow, I hope that is a knowing rather than judgmental chuckle. It somehow feels so urgent to look and see what's been going on in the world and around, but it's a bad habit. It only creates more anxiety in my life. So what I've begun to do instead is to try to not look, just get ready for the day, spend a little bit of time in prayer and meditation, set an intention and purpose for the day, and only then open myself up to the challenges, difficulties, and stresses that phone provides a gateway towards. Second is gratitude. While it's true that we cannot control the first fearful thought that may arise, we have choices of what we do next. So when a fearful thought arises, we can practice immediately calling to mind something for which we are grateful. It doesn't have to be related, by the way. A worry can arise and I can think, thank you for what a beautiful morning it was to walk over to synagogue. A concern can occur and I can be grateful for the sunshine and the beauty of this area. I can notice how fortunate I am to have the family and friends I do in my life. How great it is that when I open my faucet, drinkable clear water comes out every single time. I've never been hungry in my life without knowing where my next meal is coming from, and on and on and on, pushing away the fearful thoughts and replacing them with gratitude. 3 is to work on my connection to material things and outcomes and objects. I've noticed that this year in particular with an obsessive need to look at the news. Everything has seemed so impactful. The word unprecedented I'm getting completely sick of. And everything that happens draws my attention. I feel like if I don't look every 5 minutes, maybe the world will fall apart. And so I need a new practice. We need a new practice of looking less and allowing ourselves time to breathe and appreciate the people around us. Think for a moment about the amount of time you spend in worry and anxiety about a variety of different topics. One question to ask is, how many of them will you care about in 6 months or a year? Or even more, what will you even remember of them in 6 months or a year? And if instead you took just 10% of that time to think about how you could be a more ethical, compassionate, joyous person, I feel like that would transform all of us and our community in a deep way. And lastly, 4 is joy and silliness, play and fun, because that's how we can open up our hearts again. When I was younger in my 20s and 30s and I'd go to the beach, I used to love to chase the seabirds and jump up and down and go, birdie, birdie, just to be kind of goofy. I don't know, Carol thought it was cute. And at some point, I stopped doing that kind of thing. And I really love when I get to play with some of the little kids around the community because they invite my silliness. And it connects me then with joy. So I realize we need more goofiness, we need more silliness, we need more laughter, because it helps us realize how small our fears really are, how much of our ego gets invested in these problems that really don't matter. Then we can laugh and create room not for fear, but for joy. Rav Nachman is right. We need to cross the bridge. We need to get past and through our fears so that we can turn towards joy and meaning. But now the narrow bridge has a railing that's built on faith and gratitude and joy that can support us as we walk across. Let's join together in singing Rabbi Nachman's song as rewritten by Rabbi Baruch Haidt.
Kulo, Gesher Tzar Meod, Gesher Tzar Meod, Gesher Tzar Meod, Kol Haolam Kulo, Gesher Tzar Meod, Gesher Tzar Meod.